If you're just joining us, feel free to go ahead and put your, like, where are you from in the chat box. That's always a good time to see where folks are from and where they're connecting from. And I also noted to go ahead and use the Q&A button down at the bottom. If there's one of those 10 questions that you would really like to make sure that I answer, please feel free to go ahead and put it in. You can either type the question or just tell me what number it is on the list. But we'll go ahead and get started. So welcome to everyone. It's so great to see. I guess I can't see you guys. I can only see your names. But I miss the days when we used to do the Zoom video where I got to actually see everybody. But now we do webinars, and it's a little bit less personal for me. But I'm glad that you're all here. I'm excited to talk with you about logic today. When they asked if I wanted to do another webinar this summer, I said, of course, I'd be happy to. I've been doing them for the last several years, and usually I try to come up with, some aspect of logic or reasoning or the history or how, it's part of the liberal arts tradition or virtue, and I think that those all have a good art can be very helpful. But what I decided to do this time is just kind of go through some of our most frequently asked questions. These are the ones that our curriculum consultants get the most questions with. This is the ones that I'm most often asked when I'm out and about. And so I brainstormed just sort of a list of these 10 questions. And if you feel like there's something else that you would like an answer to that I didn't get around to, you can put that in the Q&A as well. But so Linnea asked for, I should also note, we're going to be talking a little bit about two books in particular. One is The Art of Argument, published by Classical Academic Press. This is the second year that this version has been out, but the 22nd year that The Art of Argument has been out. And Aaron Larson and I co-authored it a number of years ago now, long time ago, 22 years ago, which doesn't seem possible. And then the second one is The Discovery of Deduction. And we can talk a little bit about the difference between inductive and deductive reasoning, that kind of thing. But that's the other logic text that CAT produces. So those will be the ones that we're kind of centering this conversation around. But logic all by itself doesn't exist in a vacuum. And because of that, it's so important to think of it in relationship to what precedes it on its way to your students being ready to really think and grapple with logic. And then where does it go? How is it extended in the years after they finish taking logic? So I believe here that Linnea said that she wanted me to address question number 5, and that's a great question to start with. Question number 5 is, what age is the right age to start Art of Argument? And how do you know if your student will be ready to start Discovery of Deduction? So the right age to start Art of Argument. Now the first thing to say is that children are, they develop at different ages and at different stages. And, physically they might be developing in one stage, and emotionally, and then, sort of, knowledge academically, all of these things, your child doesn't develop all at the same rate in all of these different areas. So, So it's really it's an important question for homeschoolers to be thinking about when's the right time to start thinking about what the nature of argumentation. So there are some other texts out there, and I think that they all have a purpose, and they're all very good. The one that's kind of aimed at the youngest kids is Fallacy Detective. And that's a book that I have seen 4th graders and 5th graders using, and there's nothing wrong with the Fallacy Detective. It can be a great tool. The Art of Argument just isn't aimed at the same thing. And this is where we're switching from the Art of Argument, and what you might want to be thinking about is a couple of questions. If you expose your child to understanding fallacies when they're 8, 9, and 10 years old, there's going to be a limit to what it is that they can understand and how sophisticated those explanations are, and an understanding of how, the bigger picture that everything falls into. There's just going to be a limit to that kind of connected, what Mortimer Adler calls the syntopical, right? Being able to synthesize topics together. There's just going to be a limit to what that child is able to do. And so the earlier that you give them logic, they're going to basically carry with them that level of understanding kind of all the way through. So if you want your child to be able to reason as an adult, at some point they're going to need to get something more than the fallacy detective when, if you want them to be thinking through some of the complex ideas that they're going to be faced with as a young adult in college and as an adult in their lives. So I wanted that's one question to ask, is sort of what age is the appropriate age? And if you do it early, is there anything wrong with it? No. Are they getting the most out of it? Absolutely not. Is logic something that you should do just one time so you can kind of check that box? I would argue no, that's not the right way to look at logic. Logic is a discipline that requires that you are, you're revisiting it and you're applying it with intentionality all the way through their academics. So expecting a 10-year-old to kind of take logic with them and somehow be responsible to apply it for themselves and on their own all the way up into adulthood is probably it's a bit of a reach that most kids aren't going to do that on their own. So you kind of want to be thinking about whether or not it's important to kind of revisit it and build on it as well. The art of argument is designed for students who are probably in 7th grade, maybe 8th grade. And it's because we want to put in front of them not just it's not a vocabulary list of ideas to be named and defined. That's a spelling list, that's a vocabulary list. And there's, you do need to know the grammar of logic, right? The building blocks of it. But you also need to understand how to apply it to the issues that are going on. And so you'll see in the art of argument, we have a whole host of topics that we apply logic to, whether it's abortion, there are, abortion arguments, issues of terrorism, what's the difference between a terrorist and a freedom fighter, whether it's about, what does it mean when we talk about the way that we interpret numbers and statistics. For example, the fake precision fallacy usually gets boiled down to something that's a little bit too trivial, kind of like somebody will say, they'll quote a survey and they'll say, 90% of Americans believe that XYZ, and then you can point to that comment and say, that's a fallacy because they're misrepresenting data in some way. But most adults don't get lured by or they don't really misunderstand because somebody makes kind of an exaggerated claim like that. There's a nuance to these fallacies. There's a subtleness to them. There's something that's really kind of fine about them in some ways. And your kids have to be mature and sophisticated enough to get past the what, can I name it, and can I define it? And then can I start seeing evidences of it in the world around me in kind of sophisticated conversations and being able to take this bit of information out of logic and go take it with me as I study history or literature or listen to the news or that kind of thing. So there's a maturity component to it. So Linnea, you've asked a kind of a complex question. What's the right age? I would say 7th or 8th grade. If you're just looking for sort of a very light touch, you just want to name the fallacies and, know how to spell them, and that you can do that. But I would say come back to it again later and make sure that they're really kind of engaging with it in a more sophisticated way so that you're not expecting them to have a more mature understanding of it as they get older when they only understood it as a 9-year-old, in the beginning. The second part of the question is, when are they ready to start discovery of deduction? That's another good question, and it has to do developmentally. So there's absolutely, I want to say this clearly, there's absolutely no math in discovery of deduction. You will not find a mathematical equation in it. But I very often tell folks that if their students have not successfully completed a course in pre-algebra, they're not quite ready to take the discovery of deduction. And again, it's not because there's any math in there. Pre-algebra is not a prerequisite for taking discovery of deduction. It's just that students who have taken pre-algebra are usually able, if they've successfully taken pre-algebra, they are usually able to begin to think about reasoning in the abstract. And that's a good indicator of whether or not a student is able to do that reasoning in the abstract. Students who cannot solve for a, the X, and we don't know what X is, it's within a formula, it's not contained within a story problem, it's, we're not counting, it's not arithmetic, but we're solving for variables and things that might be changing. And, there's an abstract nature to, how they're thinking and why they're doing it. And, how that taking, solving for one number and taking that and putting it in someplace else and then, using that to solve for something else. That's usually a good indicator that they're at least ready to start thinking about that. And because the discovery of deduction begins with taking sentences in regular English, just normal everyday English, but then it involves understanding that it's really not about having well-crafted, eloquent sentences. What we want to do is we want to get to the essence of what that sentence is saying. That sentence is either referring to something universal or particular. I'm either talking about all trees or some trees, right? Universal or particular. And then am I affirming something about my subject or am I negating something about my subject? All trees are green. That's a false statement, right? It's but we're saying I'm affirming something even though it's false, right? And being able to say, okay, that sentence is making an affirmation, not negation, but it's actually a false statement. And we usually think we get terms like falsity and negation and valid all conflated. If you watch the news, you'll very often hear people say things like, you make a valid argument. And what they really mean is, I personally agree with what you're saying. It has nothing to do, they're saying, I think what you're saying is true. Truth and validity are not the same thing. And these are terms like this that a student has to be able to slow down and think about and understand and digest so that they don't think that these are synonyms for one another. That changes how we think through things. Every argument has an architecture, and that architecture has a form. That's why we call it formal logic. Informal logic means like inadequate means it's not adequate, right? If we said something is indispensable, right, it means it's not dispensable, right? In the informal means not formal. Formal logic has this architecture. That's what the deductive logic is using as a form or a structure. And that form or a structure is either valid or invalid. It has nothing to do with the truth or falsity of the claims in there. It's just valid or invalid. So students have to be able to think about the difference between what does affirming something and negating something. What does truth, what does false mean? What is valid, what is invalid? And these are somewhat abstract ideas. And then we have to be able to place them onto our propositions, onto our sentences, and we have to boil those sentences down into symbols. And now if we look at, and we are trying to look at symbols, and instead of where the sentences have no meaning anymore, the nouns are lifted out, we're just looking at the structure of something. This is very abstract. It's not hard, and we lay it out very slowly and very systematically. It sounds hard because I'm kind of just talking in a more general way, and you don't have anything in front of you, and we're not following a lesson plan. And I mean, these would be things that you would learn over a series of lessons, right? Explained and examples and exercises and that sort of thing. But this would not be something that you would want to give to a 4th or 5th grader who really cannot do that kind of reasoning in the abstract. So again, for lots of reasons, I would say do the art of argument starting in about the 7th or 8th grade. Once your student has successfully completed pre-algebra, then I would say anytime after that, you could probably start them on the discovery of deduction. And I would probably do them in that order: art of argument first, and then discovery of deduction afterwards. Okay. So the next question that I see here in the lineup is from, what is it, Amila? I'm probably not saying your name correctly, I'm sorry. Questions 2, 5, and 9 are the top choices. So let's look at question number 2. Number 2 is, how do you transition from lower school to logic to rhetoric How do grammar, logic, and rhetoric flow from one to the other and prepare as a cumulative steps from one to the other? Great question. So I think we should think of it as what we're trying. Stephen Covey, in his book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, he talks about starting with the end in mind. And so one of the things that I think we should do is start with the end in mind when it comes to your students and who are you trying to graduate? Now remember, K-12 education is just that. It's the first 13 years of education. Your child is never going to stop learning long after they become an adult, even if they're not involved in education or academics in some way. They're always going to be learning, right? So you are just trying to make sure that they have all the right resources and tools that they can then start taking their next steps, whether that's in college, in a vocation, or through motherhood or fatherhood, or whatever it might be. But they're never going to stop learning, and you want to give them the right kinds of skills and artistic abilities. And I don't mean fine arts there, but I mean liberal arts and common arts and fine arts abilities to be able to go and do whatever it is that the Lord has planned for them. So, so I would want to start with the end in mind and think about, well, who am I graduating? Because that's kind of the point where you stop being in sort of control over what it is that what they're going to be doing in a more sort of obvious way. And if you're trying to graduate someone who can reason well and who can speak eloquently and who can understand what is wise, right? So there's some discernment there. Then we've got to kind of work our way backwards, right? So the discernment part comes from living a life of virtue and exploring and cultivating the life and habits of the mind that are going to help you and your student become truth seekers, someone who is able to know what is true and be able to seek after it and be able to understand how it's wise and what is prudent to do, right? I'm thinking about that verse, Micah 7:8, not 7:8. That's the other one that I love. What's the verse? You guys will tell me in a second. You've told me, oh man, what is good, that you do justice and love mercy and walk faithfully with your God. And I'm sure the there it is, Micah 6:8. Thank you. Thank you, Em. Thank you so much. So anyway, yeah, so that's sort of the essence of what we're trying to do. So we want that's what the picture of rhetoric looks like, right? That's what we're really kind of hoping that we're going to be able to form in our child. So to get backwards from there, all along the way, we've got to be exposing them to great literature and to great virtue stories. And we've got to be talking to them about those key elements of what is true and what is good and what is beautiful. We also need them to be able to take those ideas and form arguments that make good sense, right? And that becomes into structuring our arguments and thinking logically and reasonably, making sure we're not using fallacies in our arguments and that sort of thing. But before we can, but both of those two things are whether we're writing eloquently or creating logical arguments. Before we can do both of those two things, we've got to start with the building blocks of how to construct sentences in their correct form and understanding grammar. And there's the basic building blocks of being able to communicate well, to be able to organize our thoughts well. And so if we kind of back up from rhetoric to logic, we kind of come back to writing and grammar. And at Classical Academic Press, we would say that you would then kind of start with writing and rhetoric and the well-ordered language curriculum. And then at a certain point, those two are probably going to give way to logic, and then it gives way to rhetoric coming off of that. So the writing and rhetoric curriculum, for example, it is using a rhetorical training program that was made probably not exclusively famous, but famous by a Roman named Quintilian. And he created the progymnasmata. And a lot of folks who don't want to say words that are difficult to say, like progymnasmata, they call it the progym. That's a little easier to say. And there's these 12 building blocks to the progym. Starts with fable, and then there's narrative, and then there's commonplace, and there's confirmation and refutation and crayas and proverbs and on and on and on. There's a number of these, and they're building blocks. They're tools that you teach your student how to, you recognize them, you teach them how to write them, you teach them, to understand their purpose, where they can find them, if they're looking for great quotes, if they're looking to build a good argument, that kind of thing. But we start them trying to, show them what they look like, especially back in fable and narrative and so forth. And we give them good exposure to all of these things. And we also teach them grammar along the way. And at some point, they're kind of finished with their grammatical career, if you will, and they begin to just kind of take on more writing. And that's where that writing and rhetoric curriculum sort of fills out, and thesis 1 and thesis 2, and, kind of builds out through writing and rhetoric. And we're also teaching them, then we come alongside and we start teaching logic as well. So when you're kind of thinking about how it all flows together, we tend to think of it as writing and grammar at the front end, logic in the middle, and then rhetoric, which is a combination of writing, grammar, and logic all together, with a healthy dose of, wisdom and prudence mixed in. That's what we're looking for in rhetoric. And that's what we really need to make sure that they've been well groomed for, and how you've cultivated that experience for them. Let's see here. You can find out if any of the team members that we have at the press, any of the curriculum consultants. Michelle Skinner is on the call right now, but there's also Joelle Hodge and Jocelyn Niddle and Karen Whitlock. Any of the 4 of them would be more than happy if you send in a question through customer service and wanted to ask some more questions about that kind of flow. We've gotten that question a bunch, and I've created a little bit of a graphic for it. That's a generous term for what I made, but we can send that along to you. We've got some visuals in the catalog as well that can help you kind of see how these pieces kind of all flow together. Let's see here. Question number 9. If a student takes logic in middle school, is that enough? Do they need to take it again? So I love this question, and I've already kind of hinted at it. The answer, I would say, is no, it's not enough. And I'm going to give you an example as to why. So I had mentioned it right at the beginning while people were trickling in. I grew up in Saudi Arabia. I lived there for all of my young life. We moved out there when I was about 5. I can't remember. We came back when I was around like 10 or 11. So, all of grammar school and up through, and we started middle school in Saudi Arabia. We lived on an army compound in Riyadh, and it was an international school that we went to, and the Saudi Arabian government had given permission for this school to operate as an international school and not as a Muslim school. And that's a very particular designation that this school was allowed to have. So we had students from all over the world, not just people who were there as part of the Corps of Engineers like my family was. But one of the agreements that the school had to make was that every single kid would take Arabic every single week. I think it was like 3 days a week or 4 days a week. It wasn't every day, but it was quite a bit. Every week that they attended school there, that was something that they had to learn. We were required to learn Arabic. So I started taking Arabic when I was 5. And again, I took it all the way through till when I was 11. And but the teacher there, they use it as like their special, right? So, oh, the specials teacher is coming in, the Arabic teacher is coming in, and the teacher would leave the class, and she would leave us there with this Arabic teacher, and we would get our lesson, which meant that our whole class was learning Arabic. But as soon as that teacher left the room, our regular teacher who came back in, never. I mean, she didn't have to learn Arabic. That wasn't the rule. The kids had to learn Arabic. The teachers didn't. And my parents weren't learning Arabic. And so it's not like I went home and they were practicing with me or anything like that. They couldn't read the language. They couldn't speak it. They didn't know the vocabulary. And so I learned it just in that class, and I was checking the box on it, right? And I was getting what I was supposed to have. And then I was never practicing it again. And again, I had it, and I was trying to be a good student. But I had it 3 or 4 days a week for every single week for all of those years that I was there. And by the time we came back to the United States and I went into middle school and high school, never had it again. I mean, I can count to 10 and I can greet somebody warmly. I can ask where the bathroom is, and I probably know a couple of insults that my brother told me. But that's really it at this point. And it's because we never visited again. I got it, and I got a lot of it when I was younger. But if you don't revisit it again, and as you get older, all the way up through, and if there's nobody who's going to be pulling that out of you and helping you to apply it and looking for opportunities and ways for you to, lean into it and grow it, it will just die on the vine. And so my recommendation is, yes, teach logic in middle school. But if you're homeschooling, I would recommend that the ladies in your co-op, or the gentlemen in your co-op, that they're learning logic so that they can help pull that out of the kids as they go through their classes. They need to be held accountable to what fallacies do you see in here. Let's use this as we're building on our, trying to build this this speech or this essay that you're writing. Let's start with what's your conclusion and what are your premises, and let's try to see if we can come up with a valid argument here. Is there a value, is so and so making a valid argument here? But you're going to have to help them navigate through that. And if all the adults that they're working with are taking logic, then they will be able to help them pull it out as the student matures as well. So there again, you can kind of decide when in middle school or in high school that your kids are taking it. Recognize that they are only going to have really understood it at the maturity level that they were when they learned it. That's going to be kind of how they're able to apply it. And it's probably best if the teachers that are all involved also know logic and can help pull that forward for them as the student matures. I will say that, we see this very often. A good example of this is grammar. Kids take grammar through, I don't know, 5th grade, 6th grade. But your teachers in history and literature and in science and in math, when those kids are taking the classes with them in the 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th grade, those teachers know and understand grammar, and they can hold the students accountable for that as an anchor skill that they've got to be able to have if they're going to be able to function as a high schooler. And I guarantee you their college teachers are going to say, what do you mean? I mean, yeah, you only had grammar back in the 6th grade. That was the last time you took it, but that doesn't mean I'm expecting anything less from you grammatically with your syntax and, so forth. They need to have people who are helping them to mature and refine and grow those skills as they get older. And it's the adults that help them do that, even if the adult isn't teaching them grammar or logic per se anymore as they get older. So that's how I would answer that question. And I feel really strongly about it. And I wish that more teachers and more parents were taking this kind of approach and seeing that grammar, logic, and rhetoric are the 3 anchors of the trivium. And these are the 3 pieces that are required at every stage of learning in varying amounts, no matter what discipline the student is taking, what subject the student is in. And if your teachers aren't trained in grammar, logic, and rhetoric, it's going to be really difficult for those trivium arts to carry all the way through. Usually the only one that gets carried all the way through is grammar. And even that one, not as well as a lot of people would wish. So let's see here. Question 2, 5, and 9, I answered that. So Kimberly Dismas is asked, what is the difference between this and logic at Veritas Press? Does this logic cover formal and informal? What order are they taught? And thank you. So I have copies of the Canon Press logic that's back here that Veritas uses. They focus quite a bit on deductive logic, and they give a little bit of information about informal inductive logic on the back of their introductory logic. And then their intermediate and advanced logics are usually based in deductive logic. And in some ways that makes a lot of sense. Deductive logic is the ancient art of logic. That is what Aristotle would have been referring to when he was talking about the rhetoric and his Rhetoric and Poetics of Aristotle, a book that you can buy, when he's talking about students being formed in logic as a prerequisite for taking rhetoric. He would be referring to deductive logic. Informal inductive logic, the informal fallacies, they weren't derived yet. That's a modern invention, a modern characterization. We assign some Latin names to some of those informal fallacies, but once again, Aristotle, ancient Greek, did not speak Latin, hadn't been invented yet either. So so when you see Latin names for these things, it makes them feel more antiquated. And what I mean by that, the study of informal logic is a relatively modern art. It's people have been making and using fallacies probably from the beginnings of time. But the method of sort of categorizing them and labeling them as our informal fallacies, the way we do it right today, that's a relatively modern invention, that way of categorizing things. So my point in sharing that is just to say that Veritas is really focusing on the more ancient kind of logic, which is deductive logic. And the Discovery of Deduction, the book that we provide, is really just an introduction to deductive logic. What we do in both of these two books is what they tried to do in an entire first year of introductory logic. So they spend a lot less time on the informal fallacies than we do, and they go and they do a whole lot of information on deductive logic in that first introductory book. Now, they're well laid out. There's lots of pros that I could say about them. You're going to have to kind of judge whether or not you find me as like sort of an impartial person of record here. Obviously, I'm the author of these two books. I think we did a really good job, but here's the evidence that I have for why I think these two books are a better introduction than Veritas. I have, over the years, hosted classes for students who have come out of schools where they have done Veritas logic, just the introduction of logic. And when I've asked them some basic questions about the square of opposition, or how to create categorical statements, or talk to me about universals and particulars, and just kind of spot checked right here and there, like what do they know? A lot of the kids have said it was like a fire hose. It was a ton of information. I don't remember any of it, and I didn't really know what to do with it. And I had no interest in going on and taking their intermediate or advanced logic either. Again, there are some kids that I think like they're just all about it, and that's just kind of what they want to do. The average student that I have seen that has transferred out of a school that had used it really needed to go back and take deductive logic using the Discovery of Deduction and the Art of Argument all over again. And when going through it the second time, they were kind of like, oh, now it makes sense why these pieces are this way and what I'm supposed to do with them. They really didn't understand that deductive reasoning is at the heart of good rhetoric, that they weren't being prepared to take deductive logic and carry it forward into rhetoric in that way. They were kind of learning it for the sake of learning it. And when you do that, it kind of it creates a scenario where if you don't know really what you're supposed to do with it after you regurgitate it back to the teacher for your test. John Mays refers to this as what happens is there's a cram, pass, forget sort of way that a student goes through it, and that's exactly what I was seeing. Students have to know sort of what it is. They have to master that information at whatever level that they are at. And then they have to know sort of how to apply it and what to do with it going forward, or it'll just be something that they got an A in that they don't know anything about. So that's how I would answer that question. It's been, like I said, I don't have any, I think it's accurate. I think it's, like I said, it's laid out well. It's not quite as accessible as our books are. It's a much faster pace. It's a lot more volume. And so if your idea of, like a robust education is more and, cram as much stuff in, then you're going to probably love it. We here at Classical Academic Press take a scolae approach, a more contemplative approach to education. We follow the sort of much not many pedagogical philosophy. And so we're looking for ways to provide opportunities for mastery by going deeper in some areas and not trying to give, quite as a wide berth for everything. So it's a difference in philosophy. not necessarily a right or wrong. So I'll leave it at that. Okay, so there's that question. And then is it Jay Levant? I might be saying that incorrectly. I'd like to get some wisdom on questions 2, 3, 6, 7, and 8. But if time is short, then my top 2 are 6 and 8. So I think I already did 2. And you said moving up. So I'll do 6. Oh, 6 and 8. Here we go. So how can teachers prepare for art of argument, discovery of deduction, and rhetoric alive? Great questions. So the first thing I want to note is that the new art of argument, this book, and if I was here, I'd say, show of hands, who saw the old book? The old book was great. I believe, well, I thought it was good. I helped write it. I thought it was a good book. But Erin and I wrote that book back when we had been in the classroom. I want to say I was probably in the classroom for about 3 years at that point. And then the second version, this version that just came out last year, what I did with this one, Erin is still the lead author on this, but when it came time to the rewrite, I've sort of hung up my, I'm not teaching anymore. I've got a full-time gig here at the press at this point, and I just don't have time to be in the classroom anymore. So what I did was I took all of my lesson plans, I took all of my examples, I took all of the resources of the way that I used to teach the class, all of my explanations, you know, sort of, hey, be careful, the kids often mistake this one for this one, and you know, those kinds of pitfalls. And we plugged it all into here. So I would say, if you were asking me that question, how to prepare to teach the art of argument, if you were asking me that about 5 years ago, my answer would be a little bit different. Today, I would say that the teacher resources that are in here, the explanations that are in here are really, really helpful to getting you started off well. And I think that you'll find that because we've really given so many resources in here, that you're out of curriculum preparation probably needs to be a good bit less. So I think that's the feedback that I've heard from it as well. We passed this text to a couple of our all-star Scolia Academy teachers, Ash White and Jimmy Shambach. If any of you have had kids at Scolia Academy, they are 2 teachers who've been teaching the art of argument for many, many years at this point. I gave them drafts of the new text when we were in the writing stage, and they were like, oh, this is so much better. Thank you. It's helpful. So I think we did a good job with getting you what you need there. That being said, I would also say that you have got to be on the lookout for informal fallacies in the world around you. And that when you look and you see that, like, where all of these examples come from, it's just the stuff I bumped into in my life because I was listening to podcasts, watching movies, reading books, watching the news, talking with friends. It is about lifting the information out of the text and going and applying it out into the real world. There is not a classical U course. I saw that question just pop up from Joylyn. There's not a classical U course for the art of argument right now, but it is on my list of things to do this year, as to make sort of an informal logic classical U course that kind of goes through and talks about sort of the why and the how behind behind all of that. So I would say use the world as your classroom and start. My husband says that the years that I was writing the first version of this book, that our marriage changed. He got away with a whole lot less. But if your husband is anything like my husband, you're going to give you plenty of opportunities to identify fallacies. And so I would recommend learning it, internalizing it, mastering it, living with it, looking for ways that you can identify what fallacies are, start talking about it with other people, start engaging with it. It's really something to be lived and not learned that way. As far as the discovery of deduction, that's another interesting kind of question. So there's a couple of different things that I would recommend. The discovery of deduction itself is, again, I think pretty helpful, but there are, there is a course on Classical U with that one to teach that. Now, there's a difference between, teaching a curriculum and learning the curriculum. You will probably need to learn the curriculum for discovery of deduction. It's a different subject. And if you haven't already if you've never taken a discovery of deduction class, it's probably going to feel a little bit foreign. Again, it's for 7th graders. If you're sitting on this call or you're watching this video, you can do this. Okay. It's not hard. It's just different. Okay. It's not math. And I know a lot of you are kind of like, oh my goodness, logic, math, it's not math. And I love math, so don't get me wrong. I'm not saying anything disparaging about math, but you can do it, and but you do need to learn the content of it. So there's 2 things with discovery of deduction. I have made a teaching video for just the content. You can, if you buy the curriculum, you can also buy the streaming video where I am actually just teaching as if I'm talking to students. I'm just teaching the curriculum itself, and I can help you through that video, just learn the content. There is a course on Classical U where I go through and I teach the pedagogy of why I'm teaching that way in the teaching video. And so you can, but those are 2 separate things. Learning what the square of opposition is and understanding how it works, that's learning the content of it, which you can get through the teaching video. Going on to Classical U, when I get to whatever the chapter that is, chapter 5, that's where I'm teaching the how to teach the square of opposition and why I'm teaching that way. What do I have in my mind? What do you need to be keeping in mind? And so that you can maybe see why I've structured my actual teaching the way I did in the teaching video. And I would recommend both of those 2 things for discovery of deduction. If you're really into logic and you decide that you just love it, like I do, I would recommend Peter Kreif's book, Socratic Logic, as a supplement after you've kind of done those things, after you've looked through and read the discovery of deduction, gone through the teaching video that comes with, that you can purchase with the content, and done the Classical U of the Kreeft is spelled Kreeft. And somebody's asking that in the chat. And if you can, and you've learned the pedagogical piece of it, that's kind of the core. Peter Kreeft's book is a college level text. I have taught it at the college level for college students who are taking like intro to philosophy. And it's going to be on another level, and it's going to just, sort of approach things a little bit differently. If you are thinking after you've done that, I just cannot get enough. Logic is in my very core. I would recommend that you go find COPI, K-O-P-I, and then make sure that you go, and now you are on a new path, my friend. And you're going to exceed even my knowledge and understanding of logic at that point. And maybe, hey, you do this webinar next time. The Rhetoric Alive, what to do to prepare for that? Another really good question. So Rhetoric Alive, right now we have 2 of the 3 books. The first book is Rhetoric Alive. The second book is Rhetoric Alive Senior Thesis. And the one that's coming in the middle, and I'm very excited about, Dr. Catherine Smith and Dr. Stephen Barnes, who is married to Allison Barnes, who's the author of the other 2 books. The 2 of them are teaming up to come up with a second book in the middle where we're going through and analyzing speeches and diagnosing them for what their architecture is, their rhetorical fingerprints, if you will. Everybody has a rhetorical fingerprint. And what I mean by that is everybody speaks and writes in a particular way. You have a rhetorical fingerprint, whether you have decided to have a rhetorical fingerprint or not, which means that all of you and your students, you write really well just by happy accident, or you write really poorly, or somewhere in between, but you all have sort of like a distinct way that you write. The idea here is, though, unlike your actual fingerprints, you get a choice in what your rhetorical fingerprint looks like, and you can change it. You can become, and you can learn how to style and write and compose your diction, your syntax, your arrangement, everything. You can learn how to modify those things. And writing is, we tend to think of it as an art, but there is a science to it. There are things that you can do, repeatable things that you can do, practices that you can adopt, ways that you can start to formulate what you do, and so that you can become a better writer. And what that second book does that's in between there, it actually goes through and it's going to take, I think, like 100 speeches or 50 speeches, I can't remember. And it's going to kind of peel back the layers and show you what schemes and tropes, what figures of speech, what, what is the architecture, what type of ethos, pathos, logos is it appealing to? Is it a judicial, what have you? It's going to build and kind of show you what is the architecture so that you and your students can go and mimic that. Remember, when you're learning something, there's the theory, there's the imitation, and there's the practice. And you want to go through that cycle over and over again. Rhetoric Alive is the theory. It's the, what is this all about? Imitation is where you have to see what's going on so that you can go and practice it. And then the senior thesis is where they're practicing in sort of long form. So for rhetoric, how do you prepare for all of that? Well, obviously the texts themselves are really helpful. There's two other books that I would recommend. One is Classic Rhetoric for the Modern Student by I think his name is Edward Corbett. So Classic Rhetoric for the Modern Student by Edward Corbett. And the second book is Writing with Clarity and Style. And I don't remember who that is. It's by, it looks like the author is Harris, but it's a workbook. The Writing with Clarity and Style is a workbook that teaches students schemes and tropes, and Classic Rhetoric for the Modern Student is a college level text that you could go through, and it will lay out for you the 5 canons of rhetoric and all of the common topics and all of those kinds of things. And that might be sort of, again, there's lots of great resources in CAP curriculum, but if you're looking for something outside of that, Classic Rhetoric for the Modern Student and Writing with Clarity and Style would be the two books that I would recommend to you to help, help fill out information so you can bring it to your class. I think it's really helpful for any class that you're, whether it's history, literature, writing, logic, what have you. You never want to be bound by the same information that your students are bound by. You always want to obviously know what they're going to be learning out of the text that you give them, but you want your scope of knowledge to be, outside of that to some degree. And the wider that you get and the more, how many letters you have after your name, that can be great. But sometimes those folks are, so knowledgeable that it's harder for them to bring it down to the kids. Not all the time, but sometimes that's a challenge. But then there are other people who are like, my scope of knowledge is just about where the kids is, and that's fine. Just if you can just widen that a little bit for yourself, so that when they ask you the stumper question, and they always do, you have somewhere else you can turn and something else that can help inform what it is that they're asking and kind of can set you on the right path. But that's also where Ask the Magister can be really helpful. So I just saw somebody come up asking, where does the argument builder fit in? I love the argument builder. It's by Dr. Shelley Johnson. She's a professor at Georgetown University, and she also wrote the Everyday Debate. But argument builder is I like to call it a pre-rhetoric. It basically takes the common topics of rhetoric. So there's 5 canons of rhetoric. There's invention, arrangement, style, memory, and delivery. And in the invention canon, it's all about discovering your arguments. And the common topics of rhetoric is where you start looking for how to build your arguments. At the very beginning, what questions do you ask? What is the definition? How are these things? How do you compare them? How do you contrast them? What are in what ways have we seen evidence of this in the past? What are our expectations for how this is going to be in the future? What are our maxims or our quotes or, those kinds of things that kind of influence it? I'm summarizing very quickly, but those common topics of invention. The argument builder focuses on just the common topics of invention. And so I think that is a really essential book. If you started working your way through writing and rhetoric, starting with the Progymnasmata, remember that's Quintilian's set of tools for good rhetoric. And then you come along and you try to build in Aristotle's rules, the canons of rhetoric. Now you've got 2 different kind of, Aristotle's came first, right? You've got 2 different kinds of rhetoric that we have the benefit, being where we sit in the 21st century, of blending these 2 together and really having a more comprehensive way to teach rhetoric and synthesize these. So if your students come through writing and rhetoric starting back in the 2nd or 3rd grade with the writing and rhetoric series, As they get a little bit older, you can start supplementing in with the argument builder if you wanted to. When they get to thesis, you can start introducing some of that pre-rhetoric, because as soon as they're finished with writing and rhetoric, it'll be time for them to start rhetoric alive. And that little boost of pre-rhetoric there will help those first several chapters of rhetoric alive just slide right down. Argument builder is made to be done in about a semester, and it's really aimed, I think, really well at somewhere between 8th and 10th grade. And so kind of, if you can find a way to kind of fit that in 8th to 10th grade, that would be great. Let's see here. I think the other question was question number 8. When a student begins their classical education in middle or high school, what's the right on-ramp into these courses for students who didn't start at the beginning with logic or rhetoric alive? Is it too late for them to start taking these courses? What if they're 11th graders? So here's the thing about logic. And I've given talks about this. If you've ever gone to a GHC conference, the talk that I often give to parents is, you know more logic than you think you do. There's a little, I think maybe it's a minute and a half, maybe it's 3 minutes, I can't remember, excerpt from The Princess Bride, which you can find on YouTube. It's when Vizzini is talking to the man in black and the princess is sitting there, and she's blindfolded and everything, and they're kind of vying for who gets to have her. And they have this conversation in there. I show this little 3-minute clip to the audience, and I ask them, where the fallacies are, and they don't know the words, they don't know the names of these fallacies, but they can point out where the faulty thinking from Vizzini is in that video. I also have shown a Matt Damon video. He's being interviewed by CBS News or something, and I think it's like a minute and 30 seconds or so. And in that minute and 30 seconds, I think he commits about 17 fallacies. It's all over the place. And I'm a big fan of some of his movies, but that was not his finest hour or finest minute and a half. Anyway, when I show that video to parents who are sitting in the audience too, they can point out where all of the fallacies are. They can tell. What they don't have is the vocabulary. So at a certain point, I know I've talked about the idea that it's more than vocabulary, but vocabulary is part of it. They have to know what it's called, and they have to know what it is. And the more mature the person is, the more they're going to be able to see it, understand what the definition is, and be like, oh, I know what that is. I've seen that. I've seen an example of it. Your students, if they're in 11th grade, they might just need to do art of argument over the summer. And take it as kind of, and go more quickly through it. And again, that doesn't always jive with sort of a Scholl philosophy of taking things slowly and contemplating them and that kind of thing. But if you look for, we've got to introduce the vocabulary and we've got to introduce the concepts, and then we're going to plan on kind of extending that education out over the school year. That's a great way to do it. But if you've got a school or a homeschooling situation where you need to kind of slide it in, the art of argument is really aimed at that 7th and 8th grade level. And, there are some pictures in there that make it a little bit more juvenile in some ways. Your 11th and 12th graders still need the content, but they will be able to digest it very easily and understand the concepts very quickly. So I would recommend finding a way to have them going through it, even if it's an independent study, even if it's just for one semester, but make sure that they get the content and then continue to help them play with it. When it comes to rhetoric alive, if they're truly going to know and understand rhetoric, then they really do need to understand what the 5 canons of rhetoric are. They need to understand the invention process, what arrangement means and what style means. Memory and delivery are 2 pieces that go with when you're saying speeches, not just typing speeches. So memory and delivery are important, but those first 3 canons have to do with actually writing and forming an argument for either speech or written purposes. If you have a student that's starting in as an 11th grader, then they're probably going to do rhetoric alive in the 11th grade and senior thesis in the 12th grade. And that will be plenty. They're going to miss that middle piece, right? That's going to be coming out. Again, that Rhetoric Alive book 2 isn't published yet. And we've been kind of waiting for the right combination of authors to come together so we can get this done. But you could get those two bookend pieces together and do it in 2 years. Let's see here. So Kevin McCaffrey says, we want, and I might be losing track of time. Marissa, how many more minutes do I have? She's still there.
About 30.
Oh, God. We're going to crush it. It's going to be great. All right. Kevin McCaffrey. We want to implement a logic course, but are having trouble deciding how to manage inserting a new course into an already busy schedule. What advice would you have to a school newly adopting a logic program? Kevin, that is a great question. I just sat down. So we had another school who reached out to our sales team, to our curriculum consultants, and they were like, okay, we've got these grades, and they rotate this way and all sorts of stuff. And they want us to come up with their whole curriculum, 6th through 12th grade. We can give some recommendations, and I think that would be something where I would recommend that you reach out in particular to the sales team that's here, and they'll take a Zoom call with you. They'll help you kind of figure out how to structure that. The basic ideas that I would say are, you've got to you've got to sort of decide what your priorities are. Logic does not have to be a class that has to be taken 5 days a week, but you probably need at least 2 days a week to do logic. And they probably need to be about 45 to 60-minute periods. And I would recommend taking it nice and slow and doing the art of argument over the course of the year. If you're purchasing the art of argument now, I even went through and built out daily lesson plans with sort of what questions to cover, and what projects you could do, what writing assignments, how it ties in with rhetoric a lot. I'm sorry, with writing and rhetoric and the discovery of deduction and other curricula and that kind of thing, and kind of putting that together. We built it for schools who are going to have 32 sessions, 45 sessions, 60 some sessions. We tried to give a whole bunch of different scopes of how you could kind of space things out, which writing assignments you could forego, which ones do you need to include, that kind of thing. But if any of you are thinking, I need to know how to fit in logic into my curriculum, that's what our curriculum consultants, our sales team, is here for, and we would love to help you solve that problem. So I probably won't be able to get into this too much into the specifics of your particular situation right now, but if you wanted to reach out to anybody on our team, I think we could help put something together for you and be happy to do so. Marie says, could you make a suggestion for freshmen who have completed Canon Press Introductory Logic and Canon Press Beastly Fallacies in middle school? Can I make a suggestion for freshmen? Okay. So there I would say, I would test their knowledge first, because again, I said those books are pretty voluminous. And if your students, if they really do know and understand logic, and they understand how it works and how it's supposed to be part of the rhetorical tradition, and and actually using it, and it wasn't a cram, pass, forget kind of scenario, then I'd say you could definitely start them in on argument builder and everyday debate. And that would be a great way to give them a good launching point into Rhetoric Alive. And those would be the two books that I would recommend that you do next after that. So those were the questions that were in the Q&A box, but I think that there's other questions here. And I don't know if anybody can help me Marissa, maybe you can help me find out if I've missed some of otherwise I can just go back to my list.
We had a few people asking about question 10.
Oh, okay. What is the difference between logic programs out there in the classical education market, Classical Press, Memoria, Canon, Fallacy Detective? So I've touched on this a little bit. Classical Academic Press is definitely going to start with the Art of Argument, Discovery of Deduction. Together, these two books would comprise, I would say, take 2 years to do them. They would comprise an introduction of logic, but we're really going after a mastery approach for logic in this way. You've got to think of logic as a two-sided coin. And when you think of a coin, any coin in your mind, there's a head side and a tail side, and there's really no way to tell when the two sides are sort of melded together. There's no way to tell when the head side actually starts to become that tail side. Where does one start and the other stop? That's that there's some middle point in there where they've been fused together. Now, when you look at it on one side or the other, you can very clearly see which is which, but it's really one thing. And there's a relationship between the two of them. It wouldn't be a coin if you only did one or the other. So sometimes folks want to take informal logic because it's fun and it's easy, and it's these fallacies, and you can use commercials to identify them, and they happen in everyday English, and gosh, you don't have to learn anything about the square of opposition or the arguments of the different kinds of syllogisms and testing for validity, and none of that stuff. I don't know anything about that stuff. And so they only do the art of argument, or they only do the discovery of deduction. And you're missing the fact that the informal fallacies are melded together with the formal fallacies. You really can't have one without the other. One's a vocabulary list and one's a set of processes, but what you really need is these two together. And that's where you're really kind of getting a fully formed view of what logic is. And we try to do that at the press. I'm preparing a talk for SEL for next week, and one of the things that we're talking about, and I'm going through a book by N.T. Wright, but I'm also highlighting two other books. One book called The Idea of a University by John Henry Newman, and another book by Jonathan Haidt, which I'm encouraging every parent who's putting a cell phone into their child's hand, or has already planning to, or already has put a cell phone into their child's hand, to read this book by Jonathan Haidt. He is an atheist, but the name of his book is The Anxious Generation, and it's talking about why there's like an epidemic of mental health issues in the United States, and he's providing some data about why that is. It's a very important read for anybody to read. But as I'm looking at these two books, what I find is that even though I disagree with the reasoning and some of the presuppositions that Haidt is talking about, in his argument, we arrive at similar, not exactly the same, but similar conclusions. And so the idea here that what is being evidenced is something that John Henry Newman talks about in his book, in this idea of a university, and that is that very often secular sociologists and psychologists and so forth, they start with particulars and they try to build an argument based off of what they see happening in specific instances. And they can very often build strong or less strong, strong or weak arguments. And that is inductive reasoning, where you're starting with examples and particulars, and you're sort of saying, hey, I see evidence of all of these data points. And when I look at all of these data points together, I think I can make a strong argument. And I think that that's how this looks. That's the way that a lot of inductive data-driven arguments are made. And there's nothing wrong with that, but that's the way data-driven arguments are usually made, inductively. And that's why we need to learn inductive reasoning, is so that when your students see that somebody is kind of piecing together a whole bunch of different data points and pulling it together, they're starting with individual examples, not universal principles. Universal principles is what deductive reasoning is all about. It's where you start with the origin of things. It's where you start with the axioms, which is a fancy word for, generally, sort of generally accepted, widely held principles that we all kind of agree on. Atheists don't love generally held, widely accepted principles, because they don't like to assign the origin of things back to, particulars and to specifics in that way. But Newman says that, the reasoning tool of theology gives us as Christians the ability to reason from a deductive perspective and not just an inductive perspective, because we can start with these big categories of things like you were created by a creator who loved you, and as a result of that, you have an indwelling need to be loved, and you have an indwelling need to feel valued. And of course you feel that way. It's because you were made to be loved and you were made to be valued. Hate would say that kids are finding their way to the sense that they want to be valued as well. And when they aren't understanding that there's a divine or cosmic reason for what's going on in their lives and where they can feel that love, they will settle for somebody liking their post, right? And he's arguing that same thing, but he's coming at it from particulars, and we can look at it a little bit differently. Deductive and inductive reasoning are vitally important to be learned, because they help you make sense of the kinds of arguments that you're seeing in the world around you. They help you understand whether you're talking about universal principles or data that's been gathered that's accurate and good. And in this case, I come to as coming from a deductive approach of understanding who I am and whose I am. I come to the same conclusion that Haidt does, or a very similar one, but he's coming at it from the data and the particulars. This is an evidence of why we want to take this approach and make sure that we're learning good logic, and taking time to master good logic. That's sort of the contemplative approach, if you will, that Classical Academic Press is going after when we build our curriculum. And so students can really sit with these things, talk about these things, go through dialectic exercises, have Socratic conversation, and kind of really, think deeply about what it means to have to live inductively or deductively in our reasoning skills. Memoria Press is doing a good job with what they're doing. Theirs is a little bit more like, here's here's this idea, let's say it back, let's fill in the blank, let's take a test, right? And they're creating very streamlined content, and so it doesn't feel laborious. There's a rigor to the content that's in there, but it's also not necessarily designed to be contemplative. Canon is really going after that fire hose experience. They are looking for, the master rigor level. They are looking for the most information. They are looking for highest and best and, most volume of content. But they are missing a little bit in application. They are missing quite a bit in sort of a contemplative view. They're missing quite a bit and so what do we do with this now? And how does this feed into, and how is this supposed to shape me and form virtue in my life? They're kind of missing some of those pieces to it. And then the fallacy detective, it's sort of like the art of argument light. It is for some, any kid from 4th to 6th grade can kind of take it. I think it's a great on-ramp, but I wouldn't say it's a replacement for art of argument. I would say that if you've decided that you need to do that to keep kids in the same place, and so you can do some other things, you've got sort of a one-room schoolhouse going on, you might choose to do that. But then I would also make sure that you go and you do a little bit more rigorous art of argument. You have the dialectic, you give it to them again, and you're kind of helping them through. Let's see here. Somebody is asking here, what's the best way to get in touch with your team to discuss more? Marissa is going to put an email address into the chat box right now, and you can use that to get in touch with the sales team if you need to. The curriculum consultants here are really, really excellent. So let's see here. Ken says, I came late to the meeting, so you may have already covered this. Do you have any tips for teaching art of argument for 7th grades that might come for a bit more of a sheltered background with not much experience with politics or critical thinking, etc.? That's a good question. So we say within the art of argument that you're probably going to have to you need to, I would say, as any teacher knows this, you got to stay at least 2 to 3 weeks ahead of your students, no matter what course you're teaching, right? Because you've just kind of got to know where they're going before they get there. And so I would say, make sure that you're staying ahead of the students. And if you don't particularly want to have that conversation, there's usually other conversations or other examples that you could kind of say, let's go into this one. Let's explore this idea a little bit more in there. So you might just sort of swap out, because we're going to skip that conversation with Socrates over there, and we're going to instead, there's another example here on page 42 or whatever it is, and we're going to use that one as our sort of deep dive instead of this other one over here. But I would start staying ahead. If there's one thing that the art of argument has in spades, it's tons of examples, and the teacher resources that are in there will help you find other examples from outside of the text. So, you know, if you want to find a place to really kind of anchor and focus, you could probably do that outside the text as well, with some of the resources that are there. Let's see here. I see one from Carla. How does writing and rhetoric, the study of the progymnasmata, famously developed by Quintilian, prepare students for rhetoric alive based on Aristotelian logic and Aristotelian rhetoric? Great question. So have you, let me see if I can give you an example to help illuminate the answer. So when you are studying rhetoric, one of the, in the introduction, very often they sort of talk about using maxims or you know, quotes or something to kind of get people's attention right away. For my talk that's coming up at SCL, I tell a story of two young men. One of them, you know, both of them well-bred, one family that was involved in politics and, you know, but was raised in the church, ultimately walked away from his faith in his 20s, had a very famous uncle who was a champion and an enthusiast of Christianity. The other one of 10 children, grew up in, like I said, in another wealthy home, educated by his parents. Both of these two young men ended up at the same college, and one of them became Julian, the Emperor Julian the Apostate, and one of them became Saint Basil, you know, doctor of the church, one of the Cappadocian fathers, and they were in college together. They were both raised in the church. They were both educated by mothers and Julian was educated by his grandmother, not his mother, mothers and grandmother on the St. Basil side. They both ended up in school in Athens together. And here we have two very different products that come out of what is essentially classical education. I tell that story to get it started. What is that? It's a narrative, right? Why did I do it? I did it to illuminate something, that there's something about being virtuous, right? The life and habits of the mind and faith that have to be interwoven together. It's not just about, you know, virtue as Aristotle talked about it. It's about being, you know, Christian virtue. My talk goes off into a different direction. But I use that idea of starting with an example of narrative to tell the story of these two folks. And I shared that with, you know, I'm going to share that at the beginning of the talk. Don't give it away. It's on Friday if you're coming. But the idea here is that I took one of the progym topics, which is about learning, where do you put narrative into your rhetorical argument? Where is there a place for fable? Where is there a place for argument and counter argument and refutation? Where is there places to praise and blame? These are all progym tools and skills that you teach your child in their study. And then when they come to Rhetoric Alive, now they've got all of these other kind of rhetorical tools in their toolbox. And so when Aristotle says in the invention process and the arrangement and style, well, we need to have, you know, what would be a good way to illuminate this idea? By metaphor, by example, by, you know, by exposition, by defining. So you take the tools that are given to you in the progym and you partner them with the common topics that are in Aristotle's rhetoric, and together now you have the ability to maybe write in a way that captivates your audience, gives them something to resonate with, that helps them to identify with what it is that you're talking about in some way. And now they're in, right? And you can start building your argument. These are not either or, that it's about giving your students all of the tools for excellent writing, thinking, and communication, and then allowing them to have the ability to use all of those tools in their toolbox when they're writing. So I hope that answers your question, Carla. If not, feel free to listen to my talk and on Friday through SCL, and then you can reach out to our team and we can talk further. Please add number question. Oh, let's see here. 2 and 6. I think I already did those, and 7. I think I already did that one. What's the difference between logic programs out there? I did that one. Back later. Let's see, am I missing a question?
Jolie, I'm not sure if you answered. Someone asked, is there or will there be a new video companion? I believe that was for the Art of Argument. Will it ever be streamed?
Oh, so the Art of Argument, thank you, Marissa. The Art of Argument has, right now, if you go and watch the video, it's me 20 years ago with Dr. Perrin, also 20 years ago, and Aaron Larson. also 20 years ago. So I looked a little different in that video. But what we did was we took all of the, a bunch of kids from the school where we all used to teach, and we sat down and we went through and we talked through, because we believe that the art of argument is really meant to be, when learning those fallacies, it's meant to be something that you do sort of in conversation, and you're sort of looking at things from all different sides and kind of, determining what the fallacy is and what the good argument is and where things went wrong, and that kind of thing. And so the lessons aren't me teaching or anybody teaching the lessons. The video is us sitting in sort of a roundtable discussion and discussing the fallacy. We get a little brief introduction about what the fallacy is, and then we sort of talk through examples of it. A lot of people have asked if there will ever be a teaching video for that, the way that I did an actual teaching video to teach the content for discovery of deduction. And that's on our list of possible videos to make. But the first thing we wanted to do was get a new text out. Now that we've got a new text out, it's very likely that we'll try to do another video, but that's something I'll have to talk with Erin about. We don't have any plans to do it right now, but I think it would be good to do, and we've always talked about it, so it's possible. Let's see here. Let's see, any other questions that I'm missing? Why do you say discovery of deduction was hard for them to get into? Christine Renner asked that question. Oh, she's asking somebody else that question, not me. Did you see any other questions that I need to answer? I could start.
Angela asked, how does one even start? We are new to all of this.
That's a good question. So the first thing to do to start is just relax and enjoy the ride, right? You're about to come into like an understanding of a new discipline that you're already living out. All you as an adult, what you're really looking for is the vocabulary to hang on all of the bad reasoning that you've observed in your life over the course of your life. And that's really what you're going to do. None of this is something that can I say this more affirmatively? All of logic is something that everybody does all the time. You've been reasoning your way through life, and you are just looking for, now you're going to see why, how, what do you call the various kinds of decisions that you were making. So it's new, but it'll be new for you in that sense, but this isn't going to be something that you've never really considered before. So how do you get started? Decide on, look at the ages of your kids and decide whether or not it's time. If your kids are sort of somewhere between K and 6th grade, then you've got a little bit more time. If your kids are already in middle school, then you're probably going to want to jump in a little bit more quickly and start getting them in. Just because there's only so many years of middle school and high school to go, you're going to want to, kind of get those courses slated out. There's lots of great resources out there. So first of all, the curriculum is here. Start with the art of argument, discovery of deduction, and then move into Argument Builder and the Rhetoric Alive books. If your kids are younger, you can start at the very beginning of Rhetoric Alive. Writing and Rhetoric and Well-Ordered Language. But that's too is where if you want some very specific things, you can talk with our sales team, and they will help you diagnose exactly where to get started and what order to take things in. But I also want to say that Scholé Academy has teachers on hand who do this, and they love to do this. So you can talk with the team at Scholé Academy. Our director, Joellen Blake, was, and maybe still is, on the call right now. But you are welcome to reach out to the team there, explore the classes that there are. There are some things where parents are saying to themselves, you know what, I just don't have time to learn Latin. I just don't have time to learn, pre-calculus, or maybe this is not the year, although I think everybody should learn logic. This isn't the year that I can learn logic. So, you can find teachers who are able to fill in for you while you focus on other areas. There are people who this is what they do for a living and that they love it. And you are able to use sort of that Scholé Academy online co-op to help fill in some of your gaps. So I'd say those are the 3 best ways to get started. One is to reach out to our team and to ask questions, and they can help you scope out, when to start and how to start. Second is Scholé Academy. can be a really great option to help supplement all of the good work that you're doing when you just can't get to everything. And thirdly, the curriculum is always there, and and we've really tried to make it as accessible as possible, especially, like I said, with the art of argument and the discovery of deduction. There are daily lesson plans that are there for you. Rhetoric Alive has a good scope and sequence. It's not down to the specific day, I don't think, but that's a little bit different. But the logic courses, we've tried to really trick them out with all of the bells and whistles so that you can start teaching as soon as you need to. Oh, so Joylen got her, she got support at schoolacademy.com, and that's all put in there. Is there are there any other questions that I missed here? So did we do number 4? Oh, we talked about the differences between formal and informal logic. You need to teach both. Talked about that. I think we actually hit all of them except what's different about the revised Art of Argument textbook. But I don't know if that's a question anybody has because it's been out for a year now, but if anybody wants me to talk about that one, I'll just go ahead and do it quickly. So the Art of Argument, I briefly said, well, first of all, it's all in full color now. So all of those fake ads that we had in here that were in black and white, and it was a little bit challenging to maybe see them because everything's in full color. Now the ads are a lot more easy to see. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is that we've got a bunch more graphics in here and some different tools that we've built. If you go to, and I don't want to get this wrong, so give me 1 second. If you go to artofargument.com, let me just pull this down, you will see something that we built this year that we haven't had before. There's a brand new website that we created to go along with the Art of Argument. You don't even need to have the Art of Argument in order to use it, but you can take a quiz and see how good your logic is. There's a quiz here, and you can unlock, there's 3 different quizzes for you to take. You can go down here and meet the fallacies, and in each one of these, you can click on them and you can get a description of them and then an example of them as well. So you can have your students practicing with some of the fallacies in here. There's all the fallacies from the Art of Argument are included. And then, oh, we've got to fix that. But you can shop the full curriculum. The other thing that you can do, I can't remember if it's maybe when it's at the end of take the quiz, but you can submit fallacies for us to look at. I can't see where that is at the moment, but you can submit fallacies for us to review, and if we really like them, then we'll maybe post them in an e-newsletter and that kind of thing. But we've made the Art of Argument now with the new website. We have flashcards that we've created. There's a fallacy tree poster to help students learn and organize all of the information that's in here. As I mentioned before, we have included in here all of the lesson plans that are brand new, but also just gobs of teacher notes and resources and explanations that will be really helpful, places that give more explanations so that you can stay ahead of all the kids. Oh, the other thing is that the examples, if you hadn't noticed in the old Art of Argument, it was written back in the early 2000s. So there were references in there to commercials or politics, like political figures or issues of the day that most kids, they're like, who is President Clinton? I don't know. When did he live? I'm not even sure. There was references to Michael Jordan or to various NFL football players who have long since retired. And so all of the examples in the old edition required a good bit of like, well, back when I was a kid, this is what, and that's just no way to start with a logic textbook. Not only it makes the teacher feel very old, but it also takes a lot longer to get through the exercises. So all of the exercises have been updated, and they are fresh for a 21st century audience. So that's another new update with the fallacies that you might not have to kind of go back through the annals of time to figure out how to explain to students, who Ronald Reagan was, although everybody should know because, the guy carried jelly beans in his pocket, among other things. All right, anything else that we need to go over today? I think we're just about out of time. Any other questions or anything that I can answer for anybody? Let's see. I think we answered everything. Anything else? Marissa, did I miss any questions?
We had two that I saw when I skimmed the chat. One was, not sure if I missed it, but there was a question on what your thoughts are on the lost tools of writing.
Oh, the tools of writing. Oh, so I don't, there's, it's a good program. It's not, all of these programs are good programs. You just have to find the one that you sync up best with. I think I've used it with a family that I used to tutor privately. It's got a lot of good qualities. I don't remember a lot about it now that it's been a little while since I used it, but there was a formulaic nature to it. It kind of repeated a lot of principles from one level to the next level. And that can be very helpful to, have a formula in a way that you kind of go through things. I think that when we're talking about writing and rhetoric, there's a set of skills that you get out of the writing and rhetoric as the program that you're just not going to get unless you study the program. And it doesn't matter what other kind, whether it's IEW, the Lost Tools, or any other writing program, you're just not going to get the program delivered to you that way unless you do a program that is about the program Nasmata. And with Rhetoric Alive, something that I've told my rhetoric students all along the way is that if your view of rhetoric is that you learn to write papers in the 3rd or 4th grade, the three paragraphs, the introductory paragraph, the conclusion paragraph, and over time, your paragraphs have gotten longer and the vocabulary is, improved as you've gone. By the time you get to 10th grade, you're really good at writing 4th grade papers. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that, but that's not, I mean, you can't go through the rest of your life having just mastered the 4th grade paper. What Rhetoric Alive helps you to do is to really start to understand that there is more to writing than just the introduction and 3 supporting paragraphs and a conclusion, that there are other kinds of questions that you really need to be asking and answering. And I think that the way that the Rhetoric Alive program lays things out can make that really helpful for students. So, excuse me, my voice just decided it's done. Hang on a second. So anyway, the Lost Tools of Writing is good, but I do think that it's missing just a little something that the Rhetoric Alive curriculum can give to those older students and help prepare them really well for public speaking and for writing in college. Let's see here. I think that's just about it. Do you think that before students do Rhetoric Alive, they should do Argument Builder? Marie, that's a good question. If you have time and your students are able to go through that kind of deep dive on the common topics, it certainly wouldn't hurt. And I think it would obviously, I mean, I think I don't remember what chapter it is in Rhetoric Alive. But there's one chapter dedicated to the common topics. And then, of course, they expect you to use the common topics through the rest of that book. But, if you spend an entire half a semester on really plumbing the depths and understanding those common topics, I mean, that would certainly make that really significant piece about writing that much easier when you got to it and you were trying to put it together with the rest, with, the 5 canons of rhetoric. So if you have time to do it, I would say absolutely do it. So, are we good? Anything else, Marissa? Should we?
I saw a question that you might be able to address quickly. It says, what is your opinion of using Rhetoric Alive 1 alongside a formal logic class versus finishing logic and possibly completing pre-rhetoric like the argument builder before moving into Rhetoric Alive 1?
Gotcha. So very quickly, Kevin, it is a consumable text and you would want to get a copy each for all of these texts. They are consumable. And so you'd want to get one per student. So the question that you asked me, I think, so in Rhetoric Alive, there is a couple of chapters on using deductive logic, and they are going to give a crash course of deductive logic. It's really intended to be a review of deductive logic, not the full understanding of deductive logic, but you can't get through Rhetoric Alive without having touched on it. That being said, students who are only getting it in Rhetoric Alive and they're kind of expecting Rhetoric Alive to do the whole job of discovery or deduction, they're just not going to be as well suited to kind of move forward. Again, Aristotle was assuming that rhetoric would be laid on a good foundation of deductive logic. And so I would suggest that you do the art of argument and the discovery of deduction. Certainly, if you've got time to do the argument builder, I would recommend that you do that. And if you can do those three things before you get to Rhetoric Alive, your students will just be set up all the better. That being said, we don't want to let the best be the enemy of the good, right? And so if your students have time to start with Rhetoric Alive and that's where they are, then get them involved and start them on that track. They're not going to be in a position where they just can't find, figure out which way's up at that point. Give them what you can, and just hope that, you don't want to run the risk that you cram so much in because you don't want them to miss anything. Then they start to hate the class and sort of reject, and it's just too much. And it's a fire hose kind of experience for them, and they can't carry it all with them. I'm no good at writing. I can't believe, because you're trying to cram too much in. So, if you've got the time, take the time to get through it. If you don't have the time, you're going to have to make some compromises and you're going to have to do the best you can. And again, we don't want to let the best be the enemy of the good. All right, everyone. I've really appreciated my time with you. This has been great. Thank you so much for coming. If there's anything that our teams can do to help you, please don't hesitate to reach out to us, and we'll hopefully see you next time. Take care, everyone. Have a great summer.